It's just a graph that shows how oxygen binds to hemoglobin and the affinity of the oxygen to the hemoglobin, which pretty much just refers to affinity as how strong is this bond here of the oxygen to the HB. And then, as we know, HB is our transporter to our cells. So to understand what's abnormal, firstly we need to understand what happens in a normal environment. So if I'll draw the curve here, we've got the partial pressure of oxygen on the bottom. And then at the top we've got your saturations, which is, as you know, the percentage of hemoglobin that have O2 attached to them. And one hemoglobin can have 4 oxygens. And here we go. There they all are. So what this curve is it's just showing that in a normal, this is just normal environment, as our PaO2 increases, so does the saturation of oxygen to hemoglobin, which makes complete sense. As our partial pressure of oxygen in the blood improves, our saturations are going to be higher because there's more oxygen to bind to that HB. So how I think of this curve, which might be weird, is if we have a look at this bond here, we have hemoglobin at bonds to oxygen. In a normal body, in a normal environment, so normal pH, normal temperature, normal DPG, this bond is great. So the HB comes in through pulmonary circulation. The O2 attaches via what we call a covalent bond. It then travels through the body, and HB in these normal conditions will disassociate from oxygen, so let it go when it gets to the tissues in order for the oxygen to get to our cells. And that's how it works in a normal body. Offloads the O2, comes back and picks up more oxygen in the pulmonary circulation. So what I think about is I think about this bond here, because we want this bond, this bond here, because we need this bond to attach to oxygen and let go of oxygen at the optimal time in order for our cells to get the O2 for cellular metabolism. So this bond here is a covalent bond. If you've done any chemistry, or even if you haven't, you probably know that bonds can be affected in their strength and their affinity through a number of things. So if you have an increased temperature, you have more energy, and it kind of forms a catalyst for the bond to be shorter. It's not as stable if you've got a high temperature, because you've got more energy happening. Same things happen if you have an increase in your hydrogen ion concentration, otherwise known as a decrease in pH. So hydrogen ions help this bond to break faster, and then that will make sense later when we go through the curve. The other one is DPG, but I just think of that with the temperature. So these will speed up dissociation. I cannot spell. And then you want to think about the things that are going to slow down breaking of the bonds. So things that will slow down breaking, you can imagine when it's quite cold, there's less energy, so they can't reach their minimal need to disassociate. So it's going to slow down if you have a low temperature, or if you have less free hydrogen ions, otherwise known as an increase in pH. So these things here are going to slow down, the breaking of this bond. And that's pretty much what you need in order to think about the curve. So let me I'll draw another curve. This will be our normal. Now, let's talk about a right-hand shift. So we've got PaO2 and SaO2. So in a right-handed shift, which is here, you might have a PaO2 of, say, 60. which is borderline but not terrible. Well, it is not great. And then if you have a look here, in a normal environment, a PaO2 of 60 could perhaps give you SATs of, if we go over there, maybe like 85 or something, 85%. However, as you can see, when we've got this right shift, which is caused by a change in the blood environment, we get much lower SATs for the same pressure of oxygen in the blood. Now, the reason that this occurs is if we think about our bonds again. So the curve will shift to the right when you have a increase in your hydrogen ions concentration, which is also a decrease in pH. If you have an increase in temperature, or a increase in DPG. So what happens if we have any of these changes in the blood, even mildly, it affects the covalent bond between that hemoglobin and the oxygen. So we have our HB here connected to our O2. Now if we start, perhaps we get a high pH, maybe we're in a metabolic acidosis, we've got a high lactate, our pH is coming down, maybe it's, 7.28. What happens is this bond here starts to undo before you reach your cells. So this bond here breaks too early. So then, as you can imagine, your O2, it has broken from your hemoglobin, so it's not saturated anymore. So if you think 100% saturation, you've got all of these oxygens bound to your hemoglobin. Now, say we're a little bit acidotic, and one of these breaks too early, this now here is 75% saturations. So whilst you still might have a normal pressure of oxygen in your blood, they're not any more bound to the hemoglobin because these bonds keep breaking before the oxygen reaches the cells. Same thing can happen with an increased temperature. You've got more energy to catalyze the breakdown of the bond. And then again, these bonds keep breaking, and then obviously the more acidic you get, the less oxygen you have attached, and then the lower your saturation of hemoglobin. I think that makes sense. I think one of the questions in the chat is that you might have a normal PaO2, but you could potentially be hypoxic. This is true. So if you have, say, a PaO2 of 80, but you're severely acidotic, your SATs might only be 85% when they should probably be 95 and above. However, I think it's important with the terminology. Hypoxic means your cells are deprived of oxygen, which perhaps at 85%, it depends on the clinical condition, they might actually be getting enough. So you'd need to look at other factors to determine if your patient's hypoxic, because it could be for a number of reasons. If their pH is 7.3, they've probably got a few other things going on. And then hypoxemic is about this partial pressure. So if they're acidotic and hypoxemic, they're probably hypoxic because you've got like a PaO2 of 40, you've probably got SATs of about 40%. I hope that didn't make it worse. So the reason that the body does this, obviously at an extreme, it's not a good thing because your cells aren't getting the oxygen that the hemoglobin's transporting round. However, with little shifts left and right, it can actually be helpful. So let me get rid of all this just to make it a bit clearer. So if we have someone who is, say, septic, and their metabolic rate when you're septic is going to be higher because you're trying to fight off an infection. So you might start becoming a little bit acidotic, but for a minute change, it's useful because your cells are working harder, so you want that HB to let go of the oxygen faster than it normally would, so that your cells have this rapid supply of O2. So in someone who's septic, they might become a little bit acidotic, or their temperature goes up. That's probably a better example. Their temperature goes up, they're trying to fight the infection. The increase in temperature allows this bond to be broken faster so that the cells can receive oxygen. But that's only helpful to a minute extent. Obviously, if it gets terrible, then your cells aren't getting any oxygen at all. So now if we look at a left-sided shift, my curve is terrible, we have this here. Now the left-sided shift is where that HB is bonded to the O2, and this bond here is stronger than it normally is. So when the HB gets down to your cells, it doesn't off-rid the oxygen. So in a left-sided shift, it can be caused by a decrease in temperature because you have less energy to break up that bond. It can be caused in a increase in pH, otherwise known as a decrease in hydrogen ions, or it can be caused by a decrease in DPG. So what happens when we have this shift to the left, our PaO2, let's go 60 again. However, when we left-sided shift, our SATs actually look really good. We have SATs of, say, 95%. So if you were looking on the gas, you think, oh, great, my PaO2 is good, my SATs are good, but perhaps there's other signs that your patient is not getting oxygenated adequately. Maybe their lactate keeps going up, something like that. And that's because whilst this HB might be fully saturated with oxygen, it's unable to unbind from the oxygen and actually give that oxygen to the cells. So whilst your SATs look good, there's no oxygen being offloaded to your cells, so your cells have to use anaerobic metabolism when there's a big left-sided shift. And then what this means is that your HB travels around fully saturated, your cells get a limited amount of oxygen because this bond here is so strong, and then it doesn't let go. So then your HB just keeps circulating with the same O2, and your SATs might look good, your PaO2 might look good, but actually the cells aren't getting any of the oxygen or limited amounts of the oxygen that is bonded to that HB. I'll just have a quick look in the chat. So, and one thing to remember, probably the most important, is this is only for O2. So CO2 is transported, it's dissolved in the blood. It's not attached to HB. So once your O2 offloads, the CO2 doesn't come back on. So this is a left side shift and a right sided shift. I hope that makes sense. That's just how I think about it, and I find it easier to think about what's actually happened. So we've got this hemoglobin, it's attached to oxygen through a bond, and then what speeds up this bond breaking is a high temperature and a low pH, because you've got more catalysts to break it down. And then what would mean that this bond is stronger is a low temperature and a high pH, because it's got less catalyst to break it down, and it requires energy to break down bonds. And with a low temperature, you have less energy, and same with a high pH, because you have less hydrogen ions. So just recap, in a normal environment at an optimal pH, Our HB has these 4 oxygens, travels to the cells, offloads them, comes back to pulmonary circulation, gets more oxygen. It's all working fine. When we have a right-sided shift, which can be caused by anything that affects your pH, your temperature, or your DPG, the HB lets go of the oxygen too quickly. So that's why you see these low saturations. It attaches in the pulmonary circulation, but then perhaps very quickly it offloads the O2 again, so the cells actually don't get any of that oxygen delivered. Then with the left-sided shift, the opposite thing happens. So you've got the covalent bond here between the oxygen and the hemoglobin, but this time it's really strong. So you have a normal PaO2. Your SATs are great because your hemoglobin's not offloading any O2. However, your cells are still hypoxic because it's not offloading it and they can't use it for metabolism. Yeah.